what you avoid by refusing responsibility, and how that keeps you stuck. You tell yourself it's not the right time, that you're just waiting for more clarity, more motivation, maybe a sign that it's time to move. But deep down, you already know something's off. You're not just waiting, you're avoiding. And not because you're lazy or incapable or unwilling to grow. You're avoiding something that feels heavier than the task itself, the emotional weight of owning what you know needs to change. The moment you accept responsibility, everything shifts, not just on the outside, but inside. It means confronting discomfort. It means letting go of the version of yourself that depends on others being the problem. And that's where most people get stuck, not in the doing, but in the deciding. Responsibility isn't just about action, it's about identity. The moment you say, "This is mine to deal with," you're no longer the person waiting. You're no longer the one who can hide behind circumstance. You become the one who sees clearly, the one who acts, the one who's accountable not because someone else told you to be, but because something inside you no longer wants to delay. That shift is powerful, but also threatening. Because for many, responsibility has been tied to pressure, blame, or perfection. And so we flinch. We stall. We disengage, not because we're not ready, but because we're afraid of what it will cost to be honest with ourselves. But here's the paradox. The longer we avoid responsibility, the more life begins to feel heavy and unmanageable. We say we don't want pressure, but we carry the quiet weight of avoidance every day, the mental noise, the scattered energy, the guilt we don't talk about. Over time, avoiding responsibility doesn't protect us. It disconnects us from our power, from our direction, from our ability to trust ourselves. We think we're avoiding a burden. What we're really avoiding is growth, ownership, change. And yet, that resistance makes sense. For most people, responsibility was never modeled as a healthy, empowering thing. It was a punishment, a demand, a condition for love or approval. So when life asks us to step up, not for others, but for ourselves, it triggers the same nervous system that once froze in fear or shame. But avoiding it now only keeps us circling the same patterns, emotionally frozen, intellectually overwhelmed, still waiting for something to change without realizing that the turning point is already within reach. This video is not going to tell you to try harder. It's not going to celebrate blind discipline or perfection. It's going to show you something deeper. Why we avoid responsibility even when we want change, and how that avoidance quietly rewires your identity. Through simple reasoning, emotional clarity, and grounded insight from psychology and neuroscience, we'll explore what it really means to take responsibility, not as pressure, but as freedom. Because in the end, responsibility isn't the enemy of peace. It's the foundation of it. And once you stop resisting what's yours to own, you stop being stuck. Avoidance is rarely a sign of weakness. It's often a signal of protection, a subtle way your mind shields you from something it believes you're not ready to face. When responsibility feels heavy, what we're really avoiding isn't the task itself, but the emotional friction it carries. Taking ownership means confronting the possibility of failure, of being misunderstood, of realizing that we might have contributed to our own stagnation. And that's not a small thing. For many people, responsibility triggers the same physiological reaction as threat, the tightening in your chest, the urge to distract yourself, the quiet justification that it's not that important right now. These are not flaws. They're defense mechanisms. They exist to keep your sense of self intact. But here's the deeper truth. The same mechanisms that once kept you safe now keep you small. Every time you avoid responsibility, you reinforce the belief that you can't handle what's yours to face. Your nervous system learns that safety means disengagement. And slowly, this becomes your pattern: comfort through avoidance, control through delay. Yet underneath that control lies constant tension. The mind knows something's being postponed. The heart knows something's being denied. And the longer this persists, the heavier that internal split becomes. Avoidance offers short-term relief but long-term instability. It disconnects you from your internal compass. You start reacting to life instead of responding to it. You wait for others to decide, for the right time to appear, for motivation to arrive. But responsibility doesn't emerge from comfort. It grows from engagement. The willingness to step into discomfort is what reprograms your brain to associate ownership not with danger, but with freedom. The first step toward that shift isn't forcing yourself to take control of everything. It's understanding that your avoidance isn't your enemy. It's your mind trying to protect a version of you that no longer needs protection. When you begin to see avoidance not as defiance, but as outdated self-preservation, something changes. The emotional charge softens. You no longer have to fight yourself to take action. You simply need to update the story that taking responsibility means being unsafe. And from that awareness, your internal system starts to relax. You realize that owning your life isn't a threat to who you are. It's the path back to who you've always been capable of becoming. There's a quiet illusion we often fall into, the belief that by stepping back, by disengaging, we're maintaining control. That if we don't commit, we can't be hurt. If we don't take ownership, we can't be blamed. If we don't decide, we can't fail. But this illusion comes at a cost we rarely acknowledge. The more we disengage, the more life begins to move without us. We mistake avoidance for safety, when in truth, it slowly erodes our agency. At first, disengagement feels like a protective buffer. You don't have to confront the discomfort of uncertainty. You don't have to expose yourself to the vulnerability of effort. But over time, something unsettling starts to happen. You stop feeling connected to your own direction. You feel scattered, easily swayed, unable to locate a clear sense of self. The world keeps moving, and you feel like a bystander in your own life. This is what the illusion of control through disengagement creates. A controlled environment, yes, but one where nothing truly evolves. The paradox is this: the more we try to control by avoiding, the more powerless we become. Because real power doesn't come from avoidance. It comes from conscious engagement, from stepping into situations with clarity, even if the outcome is uncertain. Disengagement might shield you from short-term discomfort, but it also disconnects you from long-term growth. You never develop the internal strength that comes from showing up, adjusting, learning, and choosing again. Neuroscience confirms this pattern. When we chronically avoid, our brain reinforces neural pathways of inaction. We become wired to hesitate, to question ourselves, to scan for threat rather than opportunity. And eventually, we don't just avoid tasks, we begin avoiding ourselves. Our thoughts, our emotions, our unmet goals. The protective mechanism becomes a prison, but you're not stuck because you lack ability. You're stuck because the part of you trying to stay safe hasn't been updated to realize that engagement is no longer dangerous, it's necessary. You don't reclaim your agency by doing everything at once. You reclaim it by choosing to re-enter the moment, one thought, one step, one honest decision at a time. Because the more you show up, the more your mind learns. Presence is not a threat. It's your way out. Blame feels like relief. It offers a way out, a way to make sense of discomfort without having to turn inward. When something goes wrong, when you feel stuck, when the outcomes in your life don't match what you hoped for, pointing outward feels easier. It gives you a story where you're not at fault, not the cause, not responsible for the mess or the stagnation. But that story, while comforting in the moment, carries a quiet cost. It places your power in someone else's hands. The mind uses blame as a form of emotional outsourcing. If it's someone else's fault, then it's someone else's job to fix it. But the longer you keep that logic alive, the less agency you feel over your own growth. You wait, you justify. You analyze why they were wrong instead of asking what you can change. Slowly, blame becomes more than an explanation. It becomes an identity. And once that identity sets in, your nervous system learns to react to every setback with external focus instead of internal alignment. Blame also breeds resentment. And resentment isn't just an emotion, it's a form of stuck energy. It keeps you mentally looping through past events, emotionally tied to the people or systems you believe wronged you. And yet, while you're locked in that loop, your future remains stalled. You can't build something new when you're using your energy to maintain an old story. This doesn't mean you have to deny when others have harmed you. Taking responsibility doesn't mean taking all the blame. It means reclaiming your influence over how you move forward. Because blame may explain your pain, but it won't resolve it. Growth begins when you stop needing someone else to be wrong in order for you to be free. Psychologically, the shift away from blame requires emotional maturity, the ability to hold two truths. Yes, others may have failed you. And yes, you still have the power to choose your next step. That kind of ownership is not passive. It's the most active form of clarity you can cultivate. When you stop outsourcing your progress, you stop waiting for life to apologize. You start designing what comes next. Avoidance doesn't always look emotional. Sometimes it sounds perfectly logical. You tell yourself you're waiting for the right time, that you need to get more organized first, that you should learn a bit more before you act. The words feel calm, rational, responsible even. But behind the logic, there's often something else operating quietly, emotional avoidance disguised as clear thinking. This kind of avoidance is harder to recognize because it wears the mask of reason. It doesn't feel chaotic. It feels like you're being careful, but care is different from hesitation. Planning is different from hiding. And over time, the very thoughts meant to protect you from overwhelm start to become the reason you never begin. You think you're being intentional, but what you're actually doing is building a mental barrier between you and the discomfort of change. This is where overthinking often takes root. The brain loops through scenarios, outcomes, options, not to solve anything, but to delay. The real driver isn't intellectual curiosity. It's emotional unreadiness, the fear of making a mistake, the fear of being seen trying, the fear of letting go of the version of yourself who never risks and therefore never fails. In these moments, logic becomes a tool for emotional self-protection. But it doesn't resolve the deeper issue. It just gives it better language. Neuroscience shows that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning and decision-making, can become hijacked by uncertainty. When fear is present, even subtly, the brain becomes cautious, overly analytical, risk-averse. And while this might seem adaptive, it often leads to paralysis. The decisions get postponed, the change gets delayed. The internal discomfort, however, only grows. To break this cycle, you don't need to abandon logic. You need to reconnect it to emotional honesty. Ask yourself not just what makes sense, but what am I actually afraid of? Not what's the right time, but what discomfort am I avoiding by waiting? That shift from surface-level reasoning to deeper emotional awareness is what clears the fog. It's what lets you see that most of your logical delays aren't about readiness. They're about fear. And fear doesn't dissolve by waiting. It dissolves by meeting it, gently, but directly. When you avoid responsibility long enough, you don't just delay progress. You start to drift into a passive life. One where things happen to you and you react. Where you manage what's left over instead of shaping what comes next. You stop choosing with clarity and begin coping by default. It's not always dramatic. In fact, it often looks like subtle resignation. Accepting less than you want, tolerating what drains you, putting your energy into managing problems that could have been avoided had you acted sooner. This kind of passivity is heavy, but quiet. You wake up tired, not from effort, but from mental noise. There's a fog that follows you, the sense that something's off, but you can't quite locate what it is. It's the weight of unmade decisions. The friction of knowing there's more you're capable of, but not knowing how to access it without confronting the things you've been avoiding. Passive living builds tension in the background of your life, tension that shows up in your body, your relationships, your internal dialogue. You feel stuck, but can't explain why. Psychologically, passivity isn't the absence of action. It's the repetition of unconscious reaction. You do what feels familiar. You avoid what feels uncertain. Over time, this creates emotional numbness, not because you don't care, but because caring without action starts to feel like failure. So you tune out, you lower your standards. You call it acceptance, but it's really exhaustion. A protective strategy that's hardened into identity. But here's the truth most people miss. Your brain is not wired for endless stagnation. It's wired for engagement, direction, and progress. Neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to change, thrives when you choose, when you move, when you commit. Even small decisions reawaken a sense of agency. And that agency is what begins to clear the fog. The longer you wait for the perfect moment to step back into ownership, the more life begins to feel like something you survive, not something you shape. But it doesn't have to stay that way. Responsibility doesn't have to be overwhelming. It begins with one internal message: this matters. I can influence this. That simple recognition is what interrupts passivity and rebuilds direction from the inside out. One of the biggest misconceptions around responsibility is that it equals guilt. That if you take ownership of something, it means you're at fault. That stepping up is the same as admitting you failed or caused harm or should have known better. But this confusion is exactly what keeps so many people emotionally stuck. Because if responsibility means blame, then of course your system will reject it. Of course your body will tense up, your mind will deflect, and your language will shift to, "It's complicated," or "I didn't ask for this." Guilt is heavy, and most of us were never taught how to carry it without shame. But here's the clarity. Responsibility is not guilt. It's not punishment. It's not about fault. It's about influence. The ability to affect, respond, shift. When you take responsibility, what you're really doing is reclaiming your responsibility, your ability to respond. Not react from fear, not freeze in avoidance, but respond with conscious intention. It's a shift from victimhood to agency. From "why is this happening to me?" to "what part of this can I move?" This shift isn't always comfortable, but it's deeply stabilizing. Because it puts the power of adjustment back in your hands. You don't have to control everything. You don't even have to like the circumstances. But once you separate responsibility from guilt, you stop carrying the emotional weight that doesn't belong to you and start focusing on what actually does. Neuroscience supports this reframe. Studies on locus of control show that people who internalize responsibility without attaching shame tend to feel more grounded, more in control, and more resilient under stress. They don't collapse under the pressure of perfection. They stay connected to what they can influence, even if it's small. That mental posture creates a more adaptive, emotionally regulated system. One that doesn't run from responsibility, but recognizes it as a tool for alignment. When you stop equating responsibility with guilt, you stop fighting yourself. You realize that taking ownership doesn't mean you're wrong, it means you're ready. Ready to move forward without needing to rewrite the past. Ready to repair instead of repeat. Ready to respond to life from a place of self-respect, not self-blame. And that shift, subtle as it seems, is where momentum begins. Sometimes the resistance to responsibility isn't intellectual, it's physiological. Your mind might understand what needs to be done, but your body pulls back. You procrastinate, freeze, feel inexplicably tired, or overwhelmed by tasks that aren't objectively difficult. And it's easy to interpret this as laziness or weakness. But often, what you're experiencing is your nervous system reacting to a perceived threat. And in many cases, responsibility feels like one. Responsibility brings exposure. It forces confrontation with discomfort, unpredictability, or even past shame. So when your body senses that tension, it does exactly what it's designed to do: protect you. Through the same mechanisms it would use in physical danger: fight, flight, or freeze. But in this case, the danger isn't external. It's internal, emotional, psychological. And because you can't physically run from responsibility, your system stalls. You distract yourself, numb out, rationalize delay. Not because you don't care, but because some part of you believes you're not safe to engage. Understanding this changes everything. When you recognize that resistance isn't always a mindset issue, but a nervous system signal, you stop judging yourself and start regulating yourself. The key is not to force action through pressure, but to restore a sense of safety around engagement. That can start with breathwork, body awareness, or simply acknowledging the discomfort without interpreting it as failure. You name the signal. You calm the system, then you move gently but decisively. Dan Siegel's work on integration shows that emotional clarity increases when we honor the body's signals rather than override them. Integration means allowing both the logical mind and the emotional body to coexist without dominance or suppression. You don't have to choose between action and self-compassion. You need both. Because when the nervous system feels regulated, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for conscious decision-making, re-engages. Suddenly, responsibility feels possible again. So if you've been stalling, if you've been calling yourself unmotivated or undisciplined, pause. Ask yourself not just what you're avoiding, but what your body might be trying to protect you from. That shift from judgment to curiosity reduces the emotional threat. And once the threat subsides, the system opens. You begin to move again, not from fear, but from internal readiness. Responsibility doesn't have to be all-consuming. One of the reasons people resist it is because they imagine it as something absolute. A full transformation, a giant leap, an overwhelming burden that must be carried all at once. But real change rarely works that way. The nervous system doesn't respond well to shock. It responds to consistency, to signals of safety and agency. That's where micro-responsibility comes in. The decision to take ownership not of everything, but of something. Something small enough to act on, but meaningful enough to shift how you see yourself. Micro-responsibility is how you re-enter your life without collapsing under the pressure of fixing all of it. It might look like choosing to follow through on one promise you made to yourself, or recognizing that one thought pattern you've been rehearsing and interrupting it. It's answering one difficult message, taking 10 quiet minutes to plan your day, owning one emotion instead of projecting it. These may seem small, but they carry weight, because each one teaches your system that you can show up without being overwhelmed by the entire picture. Psychologically, micro-responsibility rebuilds trust. Not just trust in the process, but trust in yourself. Every time you follow through on something you used to avoid, you reinforce a new identity, one that acts, not one that waits. One that takes part, not one that stands back. Over time, this identity shift is what makes larger forms of ownership possible, not because you force them, but because they become aligned with how you now see yourself. There's also a neurological benefit. Small, consistent acts of responsibility activate the brain's reward circuitry. When you engage in intentional behavior and experience a sense of completion, even at a micro level, your brain releases dopamine. Not the chaotic spikes tied to distraction or novelty, but the steady signal that says, you did what you intended to do. That's what builds internal clarity. That's what makes the next step easier to take. You don't have to take on your entire life today. You only have to stop stepping away from it. Choose one thing, one decision, one response. Let that be your starting point. Because the more you engage at a micro level, the more your system begins to feel and believe that movement is possible. And once you feel that, even for a moment, you're no longer stuck. you're rebuilding. There's a quiet shift that happens when you stop avoiding responsibility. It's not just about what you do differently. It's about who you start to feel like. Because responsibility isn't just action. It's identity. The moment you begin to take ownership of your choices, your reactions, your direction, you stop seeing yourself as someone life happens to, and start seeing yourself as someone life moves through. That's the real transformation. Not productivity, not perfection, but a shift in who you believe yourself to be. When you operate from a place of avoidance, even subtly, your self-perception stays frozen. You identify with being behind, being overwhelmed, being unsure. You hesitate not just in your actions, but in how you imagine your future. You build a self-concept around delay, around not ready, around needing more before you begin. And the longer that identity remains intact, the harder it is to access any real momentum. Not because it's not available, but because it doesn't match the role you've cast yourself in. But when you take even small steps into responsibility, that story starts to shift. You begin to internalize a new identity, one rooted in agency, in responsiveness, in direction. You stop waiting for someone else to make the call. You stop outsourcing your pace, your worth, your clarity. That's not a mindset trick. It's a rewiring of how you experience yourself. It's the internal shift from "why can't I" to "what will I do next?" This transition doesn't require you to be fearless. It requires you to be willing. Willing to update the way you narrate your life. Willing to see that your past patterns don't define your capacity. And willing to believe that you are more than the role you've been playing to stay comfortable. Responsibility is not just something you do, it's something you become. A person who doesn't wait to be rescued. A person who doesn't need everything to be certain before moving. A person who responds not because they have to, but because they know they can. And once that identity shift takes hold, everything else becomes more fluid. Choices feel clearer. Boundaries feel sharper. Time feels less chaotic. Not because the world changed, but because you're no longer bracing for it. You're meeting it. From the inside out. One of the most common reasons people resist responsibility is the false belief that it requires perfection. That once you take ownership of something, your choices, your patterns, your direction, you can't afford to make mistakes. That you must always be composed, decisive, fully in control. And that pressure alone is enough to keep most people avoiding the first step. But emotional maturity has nothing to do with getting everything right. It's not about flawless execution. It's about your willingness to adjust without shame, without collapse, without needing to be someone you're not. Maturity means you can look at a misstep and say, "I see what happened. I own it, and I'll move differently now." It means your self-worth no longer rises and falls with your performance. You don't confuse temporary failure with permanent identity. You begin to understand that responsibility is not a demand for constant success. It's a commitment to continued engagement. You stay in the process even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. That steadiness is what makes growth sustainable. Because if your sense of responsibility is tied to pressure, you'll eventually burn out. You'll chase approval. You'll try to control every variable in an attempt to avoid making the wrong move. But if your sense of responsibility is rooted in self-alignment, in the desire to live with clarity and integrity, then you can move through failure without losing your center. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be present. This is how internal authority is built. Not through rigid discipline or endless striving, but through a quiet willingness to own your experience and revise it as needed. You stop reacting defensively to feedback. You stop personalizing setbacks. You start asking better questions. What is this teaching me? How can I respond differently? What matters most right now? These are the questions that mature minds ask. Not to prove themselves, but to evolve themselves. So if you've been hesitating to take ownership because you're afraid of not getting it all right, let this be the reframe. Responsibility isn't the end of grace. It's the beginning of it. Because the moment you stop trying to be perfect, you finally allow yourself to be fully engaged. And that's where real change lives. Avoiding responsibility often feels like a form of relief. A way to keep the pressure low, the risk minimal, the discomfort at arm's length. But over time, that relief becomes a trap. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're staying smaller than you are. And that quiet shrinking begins to touch every part of your life. How you see yourself, how you engage with others, how you respond to your own potential. You start to believe you're stuck, when in reality, you've just disconnected from your own power. Because that's what responsibility really is. Not a burden, but a return. A return to yourself. To your clarity, to your direction. It's how you stop outsourcing your future to circumstances or other people. It's how you reclaim the ability to choose, even when things are uncertain, especially when they are. Not from a place of pressure, but from a place of alignment. Not to prove something, but to feel grounded in the life you're actively shaping. You don't need to take responsibility for everything. You only need to stop running from what's already yours. That internal resistance you feel, it's not a sign of failure. It's a signal. Your system is asking you to move differently now. To stop negotiating with fear and start responding with clarity. To stop performing strength and start building it, one small act of ownership at a time. And when you do, when you begin showing up with presence, even imperfectly, you reconnect with a part of yourself that's been waiting. The part that knows you're capable of more than delay, more than deflection, more than managing the fallout of avoidance. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to fix everything today. You just have to stop stepping away from the life that only moves forward when you do. This is how you get your power back. This is how you get your life back. Not by waiting to feel ready, but by choosing to engage, even when you're not.